I'm grateful to be able to learn and draw from these practices and to hear about Teshuva, restorative justice, and accountability at the intersections from our three speakers. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Alissa Ackerman, a professor of criminal justice, a sex crimes expert, a restorative justice facilitator, and a survivor of sexual harm. Welcome to April Baskin, a diversity consultant and leader in anti-oppression, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and the director of racial justice at the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. Also welcome to Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, a rabbi and author who does a lot of work at the intersection of spirituality and social justice issues and is now working on a book about Teshuva. After our speakers reflect on some of the questions that we have been discussing together, you will have a chance to ask them some of your own through the chat function. Welcome to our three panelists. So I'm going to begin by asking you a question that allows you to talk about what does repairing the harm mean to you in the work you do specifically from your vantage point. So we're going to begin with Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg. What does repairing the harm mean to you?
I'm a rabbi, so I go to the sources, and a lot of my work right now is based on Maimonides, who is, sometimes as the Rambam, and whose work on repentance is sort of the cornerstone of how we think about this stuff in Judaism. And for the Rambam, there are basically 5 steps with some nuance. There's a public confession, a public acknowledgement of harm. There's beginning the work of transformation, which, in Rambam's time might have involved, changing your name, crying out, prayer. Now might look like therapy, education, but begin first naming and owning fully the harm caused, then beginning to try to, maybe to some degree even understand the depth of the harm and to try to begin to grow and change. Then, and in Maimonides, it's the time frame isn't clear, but these are the steps, and it's notable that this is the order they're listed in. Amends of the harmed party, and it says to appease and to pacify. It's a victim-centric, look at who you harmed, what can you do to create healing for them. It's not about checking the thing off your list, releasing your obligation. It's about taking care of the person who needs care in whatever way you can. And then apology, right, before witnesses, and then making different choices next time. And so there's a whole journey and a whole process. And I'd say the vast majority of the cases when we think about accountability and repair now, maybe hit a couple, but very, very few even approach all 5 of these steps. And I think we need to be surfacing them much more in our day-to-day.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for those practical steps, which we'll talk about more. Alissa, can you please tell us what does repairing the harm mean to you from your vantage point in the work that you do?
Sure. So as a restorative justice facilitator, my answer is actually very similar to Rabbi Ruttenberg. For me, repair means recognizing who was harmed, recognizing the harm that was caused, naming it publicly, repairing that harm via some form of dialogue. So gaining understanding from all parties involved, to name how they are feeling, to name the consequences of the harm that have happened, but always in a survivor-centered approach, always. Helping people to gain insight and understanding about the harm that they've caused. And then, of course, an apology and full public accountability of that harm. And then changing the behavior that you've engaged in. So I think in many ways it sounds very similar to what Rabbi Ruttenberg was saying.
Thank you so much. And April, from your vantage point in the work that you do, if you could talk a little bit about what repairing the harm means to you.
So what I could say is that there's so many things to say. First of all, before I respond to that question, I would also just love to thank you, Guila. I think in general, as a human who cares about respecting Native folks, and as someone specifically with Native heritage, I appreciated not only the land acknowledgement, but specifically that you talked about the origin of this practice around restorative justice. I'm sure it's not the only time it's been done, but it's the first time I've heard that, and it was personally moving for me. So I wanted to thank you for that. It meant a lot. And to answer your question, I think very much in alignment with Rabbi Ruttenberg and Professor Ackerman, what I would say is that this work, as it relates to Jewish racial justice work, is quite similar, that there is a profound need for healing and repair in our society in general. And we could talk about the macro needs around that align pretty closely with what my colleagues already named around there being a need for really looking at what took place, and there being a public process, whether that's through a truth and reconciliation process or any number of collective processes that is incredibly important for the healing of our country, not just for African heritage people. My understanding as an anti-oppression educator and leader is that oppression hurts everyone involved. It hurts the targeted community the most, but it also is incredibly dehumanizing and creates long-term damage for the non-target group as well, and that group being white America. And so that healing process is something that our country is lacking in, that as we're seeing in the protests and a lot of things that I attribute around the incredible amount of unbridled gun violence in our country, and a number of the tensions that are occurring now, tie back to the fact that this fundamental, profound harm, we've never gone back and fully reconciled that in the ways that Alissa and Danya spoke of, and that's needed. And for me, that starts, there's much more that can be said, but that starts on a micro level. And so in my work, in terms of leading the Jewish social justice field around racial justice, and my work more broadly with the broader Jewish community and with movement partners, is around helping folks build what I might call metaphorical musculature, or just a practice of regularly engaging and taking courageous action and acknowledging shavira, acknowledging brokenness or when mistakes are made, and practicing teshuva and tikkun, practicing repair, redemption or apology and healing work. And there's more I could say, but I think that is a good intro for now.
Thank you. This is so excellent. The steps, acknowledging that we need to fix what is broken. We need to repair what we've done. So my next question is about who are we talking about when we talk about repairing the harm? Because it's very easy to say we're talking about them, especially in this moment, and especially around the conversations of safety, respect, and equity. And I want to hold in mind what Ilana Ween said this morning about all of us wear multiple hats and different identities. So who are we talking about when we talk about this work? Dr. Ackerman, if we can start with you.
Thank you, Guila. I think we're talking about all of us. I think that all of us are capable of causing harm. I know that all of us are capable of causing harm, and all of us have experienced harm. So we are all survivors of something. And for me, when I talk about restorative justice and repair and accountability, it's not just when somebody offends criminally. It's a way of life, right? So I actually talk about this as restorative practice as opposed to restorative justice. And if we engage every interaction and every relationship we have with restorative practices in mind, we can heal harm both in formal and informal ways. So that means that we have to take all of our relationships seriously, envisioning ourselves as interconnected with all people, with all institutions, and with the environment. And we have to recognize that our words and our actions impact other people. And when we impact them in a harmful way, we have to be responsible for that. So I think, who are we talking about? We're talking about all of us.
Thank you. April, would you like to add to that in terms of who we're talking about when we're doing this work?
Yes, I would. And I think consistently throughout this experience in general, I'm just going to be building off of my colleagues in different ways. So ditto to everything Professor Ackerman said. And then what I would add to that is that we're also, in terms of the who, talking about what. And we're talking about systemic oppression, whether it's around sexism and male dominance or racism. And as was already said, that in general, I think outside of like poor children, of small children throughout the world, almost all of us, because of all the identities we inhabit, we are both members of groups that are targeted and members of groups that are not targeted. And so what's coming up for me in terms of the response to this question is, let me root myself back in the question. Who are we talking about? Is that it's everyone. And that in various areas in our lives, we are a part of the group that is more privileged and therefore systemically is attached to the ways that there is societal or structural harm being done. So even if we're not doing it interpersonally, and I share what seems apropos to share is this wonderful metaphor that racial justice leader and scholar Beverly Tatum talks about, where she gives a metaphor that around systemic oppression. She's talking about race, but you can also apply this to sexism and sexual violence, is that basically systemic oppression is like a moving walkway at the airport. And you can walk on that moving walkway and game the system, but even if you do nothing, it's going to carry you faster than the people who are not on the moving sidewalk. And in order to contradict it, you not need to turn around and start walking in the opposite direction, but you need to do it in such a way that you're moving faster than the walkway is moving in order to compensate. So meaning we need to, through learning, so this is not something that's overnight, but through a process of learning and being in community around this, learn these skills. Because if we don't learn those skills, we're part of that collective that unless we're contradicting it, unless we're anti that oppression and intentionally so, we are directly or indirectly supporting its perpetuation.
Thank you. Rabbi Ruttenberg, who are we talking about?
I mean, yes, and I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of agreement on this panel. Co-sign everything that was just said, and I just want to name that this is kind of a risk in some ways for SRE to be having this panel here, right? SRE is a young organization; they're just getting the movement going, and it's very easy, I think, for people to be like, great, and this is the restoration, repair, all the problem, we're going to fix it. And like, get those guys back to work kind of space. And that's not, this, I think why this panel is so important is because I think it's a call for everyone to raise the bar. I think it's to extend what April was saying, it's hard work to walk backwards on a moving walkway, right? It's exercise, it's strenuous. And it's, and depending on where you are on that walkway, there's a while you're going to get before you can get to the just solid ground and you're panting, right? It is so easy just to flow downstream. And I think a lot of the people watching are people with some piece of institutional power. And certainly, we all have axes of privilege and oppression. And we all hurt and are hurt. And I think this who we're always talking about is the people that we are hurting or that we might hurt if we don't do the thing, right? Who we always have to be talking about is the people who are most vulnerable, is the people who have been victimized. And I think, in terms of thinking about this in the context of SRE, so much of the work that needs to be done now is about having your institution not re-victimize someone who has already been victimized. And it is hard work. And we have to have the will, not just on a personal, individual level, but from the positions and the places of power that we hold, to walk that way, even if our institution is going this way, even if it seems like the whole community is, even if, the question about consequences is there. One of the other little piece I just want to add about consequences, because I didn't say in the beginning, and I think it's important, is that part of Teshuva, according to Maimonides, is about accepting the consequences of your actions. And so someone can do the honest and powerful and true, real work of repentance and repair for the harm they caused. And that does not mean that we owe them a prestigious role in the community. It does not mean that we owe them entrance to any space where their victim might be. It does not mean we owe them, certainly if they haven't, we don't know, but even if they've done everything, they're not entitled to anything, because some of the natural consequences of causing harm may be a certain estrangement from the community. And we've seen in cases where people really do the work and do it honestly, like Rabbi Yosef Blau comes to mind, someone who aided and abetted a perpetrator to go back and work with children, understood later what he had done, and spent the rest of his life fighting for survivors, right, and working to change his community. That's not, like, of course, you know what I mean. He didn't just take his place back. He went and did work, and as a result, the survivors said to him, "Of course, like, please come. You're on our side," and we see that. And I think that's an important distinction.
Thank you. So I'm hearing so many great thoughts, and I know we're not going to get to all of our questions because you're each brilliant in your own way and have so much to share. So I'm grateful for this. But in thinking about what Alissa said about restorative practice, it's a way of life, and thinking about April's amazing analogy about standing but still being propelled forward, and in thinking about what you're talking about now, Danya, in terms of consequences and things like that. And acknowledging the risk that SRE is taking in this conversation. And we welcome that risk. That's why we're doing this. We're thinking about the continuum of accountability. What does a continuum of accountability look like when we're talking about a continuum of wrongdoing that can occur among the many behaviors that fit along the stream of safety, respect, and equity? So for example, if this is a practice, does repairing the harm only apply to the most egregious cases? Obviously, the answer is no. But if you can speak what you think about the continuum of accountability along those behaviors. April, if we could start with you for this question, unless you don't want to start.
I can, as long as you're okay with starting with the racial justice frame first.
Yes.
Kosher? Okay. Okay, great. So, and it all aligns. So when you talk about this, it reminds me of a specific concept that I've been thinking about and developing in my own work around how we navigate harms that are committed when working across lines of difference, whether that's around anti-Semitism or racism. I think I personally I will let my colleagues possibly, and they don't have to, speak to this, what I'm talking about, this model's applicability as it relates to sexual harm, because I'm a survivor myself, and I haven't thought about this model through that lens, right? But in the context of racial justice and broader work, I often frame things because I notice at times within our community, there's a misjudgment at times around the harm done. And I often think of ways of measuring what happens in our community when we're working particularly across lines of difference, and even within our own community among people who have who have a marginalized identity, whether that's around gender or race, that I have an oppression, what I refer to as this concept of an oppression scale, that's like a 1 to 10 scale. And as a person of color in this country who's had, through my own lived experience and the experiences of my family members in my lifetime, have had a very nuanced array of experiences, everything from being called the N-word, to being denied loans, to my father being beaten by the police when I was in middle school, while he was on medical leave from Accenture, to both my father and my brother at different points in their lives being stopped at gunpoint. And so I have a finely honed scale, right? And at the same time, I also have another scale, or what I call an emotional barometer. And so when I think about this work, any experience along that scale can spike my emotional barometer at any point, right? If someone publicly humiliates me and calls me the N-word, which hasn't happened in a long time, but happened as recently as 20 years ago when I was in college, or anything else can affect that. And I find that within the Jewish community right now, here's my theory, is that over the past 70 years, when I saw different quotes from Jewish leaders from the 1960s and 70s who were talking about their alliances with the Black community, and through quotes that I've seen as presented by Professor Mark Dollinger, shout out to him and his work, that the quotes were highly nuanced in a way that I think is often missing in our community. And when I saw them, it made my heart ache because I was like, oof. Boy, that would be nice. And this is a kind of an interesting statement. But, for instance, he shared this quote. I can't remember if it was, I think it was the ADL at the time, a leader of the ADL, an internal memo where, I need to make this fast right now, so let me wrap this up. That someone wrote, we're noticing that there is some anti-Semitism that's starting to emerge within the Black power movement, and we're a little concerned about it. So we're sending in a spy, but we want to keep a low profile because we don't want to do damage to our collective work in this way. We want to keep track of what's happening. We don't want to interfere with the broader racial justice movement. And that kind of nuance I find is missing today. And the theory that I had around that is I took time to think, right? Like, what do I have in common with these leaders? And these leaders, most of these leaders in that period of time, when they were born, they weren't considered white. Conditional whiteness status didn't happen until later in their life. These leaders also lived either through themselves or witnessed the Shoah. They faced often getting their noses beaten in or being threatened physically. And so they, like me, I think in a different respect from being a person of color in this country, had a much more finely honed sense of danger and levels of harm, that there could be anything on a range from 1 to 10 of a scale of racism or anti-Semitism. The ways you handle those things are very different and require different courses of action, depending on not only where they are on the scale, but who was involved, variables. So that's some of how, in terms of specifically in the context of racial justice, as well as dealing with anti-Semitism and working across lines of difference, that I try to calibrate my responses when we're dealing with harm that's been committed.
Thank you. I think you're raising the point of nuance, just makes it even stronger the need for a continuum of accountability, just like there is a continuum of wrongdoing. Rabbi Ruttenberg, can you respond to that question, the continuum of accountability? What does it look like when it comes to Teshuva specifically?
I mean, what do we say? Avera goreret avera, like harm drags other harm along with it, right? And I think it's important, there is a whole strain. We've seen, I'll use the lens of sexual abuse, since Me Too in particular, but even before, of people who are complicit or even perpetrating harmful environments, harmful culture, making harmful choices, saying, "Oh, but Harvey Weinstein, or even this person who, abused his power and harassed people. Well, he wasn't Harvey Weinstein." So, and pointing at the most egregious cases is a wonderful, convenient way of letting yourself off the hook, letting other people off the hook, letting people in your community off the hook, right? Letting your HR department off the hook. The person only said this thing to someone while they were busy trying to do their job, so it's not Harvey Weinstein. And we have to be really vigilant, not only about not only what people really want to call the sort of lesser levels of harm, but also in terms of institutional response to that harm, right? And the way a culture is built, the way a culture is created, whose thoughts and ideas are taken seriously, whose thoughts and ideas are dismissed, what causes HR to get involved or not. And obviously, HR departments are often defending the institution and not victim. It's all part of a culture, and it all it all builds to something, and it is much easier to do tshuva for smaller harms than larger harms. So we need to catch those, heal those, and then, like that is one way that we can be healing a culture as a whole, is by sometimes inviting, and sometimes if invitations don't land, then we have to demand people do the work.
Yeah.
There's more I want to say. I don't know to what degree we're supposed to be answering the questions as they're coming up in the chat screen, or if you want to be handling that, Guila, but I'll pause there.
Yeah, thanks. We're going to go through some of our questions, and then I'm going to embed some of those in the questions that we have. Some I see are similar because I'm getting some in WhatsApp at the same time. And then I will have specific, the last 10 minutes we'll do for questions from the audience. So thank you. Dr. Ackerman, specifically when it comes to sexual misconduct and sexual violence, some people feel that sexual violence should be reserved for the most egregious cases. Others believe that all of the different activities and behaviors fit on that continuum. So what does the continuum of accountability look like when it comes to sexual harm?
Thank you. I would first say that I agree wholeheartedly with both of my colleagues. Everything that you said resonates a lot. When I think about the continuum of accountability, I think about the continuum of harm. And the first thing that I will say is that there are no comparisons. That for someone, they might experience something that I might feel is minor, but for them is incredibly, incredibly harmful. It is not for me to decide how somebody experiences some kind of harm. And harm is nuanced. I would also say that for a lot of people who engage in sexual misconduct and sexual harm, they don't realize that what they are doing is harmful because we are not having these kinds of conversations, right? So yes, all of us agree that these egregious, egregious cases are harmful, but we're not having the conversations around sexual misconduct in the workplace as being just as harmful. And I would add that the institutional response to harm is often more harmful than the harm itself. I think that the continuum of accountability doesn't necessarily always include the person who has been harmed because they might not be ready to have that conversation. And it is never for us to force somebody into a conversation and take away more control from the control that they've already lost. So we can be doing the repair work. We can be looking inward about our actions without having to engage the person who has been harmed. That said, the continuum of accountability should include the voices of people who have been harmed. And what one person wants in an instance where they have been harmed may be very different from what somebody else wants. And we can honor both of those things within our institutions and within a legal framework.
Thank you. So I'm curious, we're talking about harm, we're talking about looking at the continuum. How do we make this doable for people? How do we get people to say, I know this sounds scary, but there are actual steps I can take? Rabbi Ruttenberg talked a little bit about some steps that Maimonides gives us. Does it translate to today in 2020 in a culture where sometimes doing repair work is not always accepted, might not always be genuine, therefore should not be accepted? So how is repairing the harm doable from each of your vantage points? We'll start with Rabbi Ruttenberg.
So, I think it is doable. And I think what it looks like on an individual level versus an institutional level is different. On the individual level, it's hard, right? There's a lot of deep introspection that has to happen, a lot of heavy emotional work to really hear and listen. If you don't know that you did something and somebody brings that to your attention, to be able to hear and receive that. By the way, a phrase I heard recently that I love, that is I'd like to offer all of you, is thank you. I accept that education. Right. But sometimes there's some real painful internal work that has to happen to even face the story that we've been telling ourselves about who we are is different than this, turns out what we've been doing, and that we're not the hero that we would like to believe that we are. And even if we meant well, right, it doesn't matter. Like if you hurt somebody, you hurt them, and it doesn't matter what you were thinking was happening. You still have to clean that up. And so it's hard and it's painful, and people have a lot of issues and shame, particularly around structural, racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, etc. I think it's helpful to remember that we are all swimming in what Elizabeth Schuster-Ferranza calls the kyriarchy, right? This system of power and dominance. I am a white person growing up in a white supremacist culture. I have been, given racism in my orange juice since I was a small person. And it becomes easier to clean things up when you realize that the harm you caused may be like you have some deep work, like therapy, education, like work on it, figure it out. And it doesn't have to be all of who you are, right? You have the possibility to become a different person. You have the opportunity to learn and grow, and that your actions then don't have to be who you are forever. It's not talking about racist bones, right? Your choices are maybe racist. Your words may be racist. But you have the opportunity to change and grow, and that's an invitation. And when you think about it that way, you can take that darkness and bring it to light. Public confession is about taking the darkness and lifting it up. Then it becomes really empowering and healing. It should be most of all empowering for the person who has been harmed. And if you do the work, it can be powerful and healing for the person who has caused harm also. And I think that's true institutionally too, honestly. There are issues, oh no, this opens us up to litigation, but I think all of the steps apply, and I think the healing work does too.
Thank you. Thank you. April, I'm going to just add a question to this one for you, because one of our panelists, one of our participants has an extra question. So it's, how is the work doable, and how do we not overburden Jews of color with the work or tokenize them by asking them to help us do it or to do it for us? So how is repair work doable?
Great. So what I would say is that in terms of not overburdening Jews of color, I just shared this last night on a call with some lovely British Jews from the UK, it is by starting with the understanding that we're all interconnected, and that every person on this call, if they're Jewish, is a member of a multiracial Jewish community, and that gets to be a part of your identity. It's not often how a number of us were conditioned, but as a people who started in North Africa and West Asia, or also known as the Middle East, and have lived around the globe, we are a global people. And yet there's a part of American exceptionalism and combination of white supremacy culture that has people just in general in the States often kind of believing that there's kind of that history, but it's also kind of living us all along, and how things are here is how they've always been. That doesn't really extend into other parts of the global community. And so I think that that's a starting place to begin this, and that this is all of our collective work, that we all need to engage. Again, because it's almost like a circle to me. It's connected. There are the people in the target group and the non-target group, and we're interconnected. And it needs we all collectively need to engage in this work. I feel like I could probably say that more powerfully, but I'm trying to respond to that while holding my other responses to the rest of the question. So
you're doing great. It is powerful.
Okay, great. And then what I would say in terms of the rest of this, and I wrote a resource about this I'll happily refer people to, is that I created a list of 10 guiding principles around racial justice for advancing racial justice through my work at the Roundtable, and we've even made it into posters for folks if you want to print it out. And it's rooted in Jewish values, and it covers a few key things that I'd like to address now. One, that fundamentally in the work, I make a distinction. I don't know if this is true for others, but I make a distinction between people's inherent goodness and behaviors, thought patterns, policies that need changing and that can be corrosive and oppressive and awful. But in the work, I make a very clear distinction repeatedly and over again, because I find, for me anyway, that in the conversations when it's not people's mental merit or value, that's never on the table. That's not what we're looking at. We're looking at the oppression. And like I'll do this little mini demo that this wonderful professor, I hope I'm not going to get my laptop wet, does. Professor Barbara Love, some of you might have seen this before, but if you haven't, she does this metaphor where like oppression is like as though like you have tissue on your hand, it's like wet, and like we have these oppressive things like Danya was talking about, like it's like water, it's in the air, it's just on us. And part of my anti-oppression work is to gently try to peel back some of the layers and have you start to see that I'm not actually ripping you apart. We're actually just taking off the stuff. And as you start to do more, you're like, oh, yeah, ew, gross. Like you can just get it off and you can be you outside of those different thought patterns and understandings of the world. So there's a process of unlearning that needs to take place, both around race and racism, as well as elements of sexism that just we receive in school, particularly around race. And so there's a process of unlearning some misinformation and relearning to do new things. So there's a certain amount of humility that comes with that. But again, I continue. There's other points I could share. I'll just share one more very briefly, which is another value that I put in there as a hybrid of values that I call in English compassionate accountability. That I find in this work, it's incredibly helpful to hold a both and in a number of ways. We can both be a part of an oppressed group and also an oppressor. And similarly, we can have compassion and accountability. Because I find in my line of work that people get hung up around the fact that they've been hurt. And compassion and accountability says, yes, that can be true, right? Instead of being in this tug of war between two things, it can be that, yes, we are part of a people that has been targeted for destruction as Jews and as members of other groups as well. Full stop. There's no question in that. And that deserves profound attention and healing. And that can be true. And we can also be a part of a broader group that is also doing harm in broader society, as well as among Jews of color in our own community. And both of those things can be true simultaneously. So I find in this work that it's helpful to bring in a couple of those lenses and those frameworks that help us hold some of the complexity of this work. And again, reiterate that our value is not on the table. As my father used to say, and I'll conclude with this, like he would always say as a child, and so just channeling what he would say to like 3-year-old April, I'm very angry, but I'm angry with what you did. I'm not angry with you. And what you did was bad, but you are not a bad girl, right? And so it's like that thing that I think at times that fear of shame keeps people from saying, well, I'm not racist, or, oh, no, but what you did or what you were part of is racist, right? You might not be in your heart, but that's on your skin and we need to get it off.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And to everyone who's listening in, we have put together a set of resources for you to read if you're interested. Further readings on restorative justice, on Teshuva and accountability. And April, I'm going to ask you to share with me the values that you've created, and I'm going to add that either to that list or on the Huva app. You will find it there. I know there's a lot of things there. So thank you.
Great, thank you.
Dr. Ackerman, I want to ask you, when it comes to sexual harm or misconduct or violence, how is this work doable? And participants want to know, how is it different when it's done by organizations and institutions versus when it's done by individuals?
It's a great question. And again, April, everything that you said, yes, like the organization that I run for restorative justice is actually called Ampersand's Restorative Justice, because we can hold two things at the same time. And to further what you said, when we see issues of sexism and sexual misconduct and racism and homophobia and transphobia, our responses are often very emotional. And we often approach these issues that cause harm as well, right? So the way that we respond is harmful. We're not actually reducing any harm. And when you approach somebody in a very emotional way, they put a wall up. And if that wall is up, they cannot take in what it is that you are saying. They can't hear that they've harmed you in some way. So when I think about this work with individuals and with institutions, it begins with creating safe spaces for people to be able to begin to reflect. That can happen at the individual level, and it can also happen at the institutional level. At the institutional level, it is as simple as we did wrong, right? Or the way that you handled this situation harmed me in this way. And we need to have a conversation about how all of us deal with that harm. So oftentimes when we work with individuals, we do what we call victim offender mediation, or we do some type of restorative circle that brings in community members and support people for the person who was harmed and the person who caused harm. The same can happen within an institution. It's just a matter of how we shift the circle. Remember, restorative justice and accountability is a framework. It's not one specific thing. It's a set of values that we use. So I think that it is doable at both levels. It's just who must be at the table. And that might be different for an individual than it is for an institution, but the principles are the same.
Thank you. I have so many questions, and I'm getting questions from our participants. So we're going to go until 3:15. So I will ask you all to reflect on one other question, then we'll get to participants. There are some misconceptions around repairing harm or around restorative justice as a practice, and they feel like sometimes they're on two opposite ends. On one hand, I know when SRE started talking about restorative justice as a possibility and bringing it into Jewish spaces, and Dr. Ackerman, you and I had been talking about doing this, we always get the question of, but isn't it soft or easy on wrongdoers? Doesn't it prioritize bringing them back to their prior role, which Rabbi Ruttenberg sort of addressed in the beginning? And so that's one type of comment that we get. And the other hand, we get, it's too messy and it goes too far and it's not legally required. And doesn't it just increase your liability, which Rabbi Ruttenberg, you also mentioned. But that's why this conversation is risky. But we wanted to have it. We wanted to start having this conversation and to have it in an intersectional way and to look at the various types of behaviors that require repair. And so can you speak to either of those ideas? So whether it's, it's too soft, it's about centering the perpetrator, which we also found in our SRE research report, that the stories in the Jewish media were more about those who have harmed than they were about those who have been harmed. And a year later, we continue to see that the women who have come forward and others are not centered. And how do we shift that? If it's a year later and I'm still having to say the same thing, why hasn't that changed? And on the other hand, for organizations or individuals who want to do this but feel like it's too messy, it's too complicated, I'm going to get in worse trouble for saying I'm sorry, so it's just not worth it. You can jump in here. I won't volunteer anybody. Who unmutes first? Dr. Ackerman.
So I'm happy to jump in. First, I would say that just because there's not a legal requirement doesn't mean we don't have a moral responsibility to hold people accountable and to be accountable. And yes, relationships are messy, but that doesn't mean that this is soft. So when we are talking about restorative justice, it is really important that people understand that restorative justice is not necessarily about forgiveness. It is not about reconciliation. There should never, ever be any pressure on somebody who has been harmed to seek forgiveness or reconciliation. It's not mediation, right? And sometimes people think, well, restorative justice is mediation, but mediation sort of assumes a level playing field. And when somebody has been harmed, it is not a level playing field. Restorative justice is really, really hard work. So I do this work with people who have committed egregious offenses and people who have committed more minor offenses. The men and women that I have worked with who have caused sexual harm have told me they would rather sit in a prison cell than have to face somebody that they have harmed. Mm-hmm. So this is not soft at all. This is much harder work because it requires you to dig deep. It requires you to look at all of those layers. And as you take off one layer, then you hit another layer that you have to deal with. This is an educative process. It doesn't happen overnight. And restorative justice is not just, I'm sorry, right? This is long-term work to hold yourself accountable, sometimes lifelong work to hold yourself accountable. So anybody who thinks this is soft really does not understand what restorative justice entails.
Thank you.
Okay.
Rabbi Ruttenberg?
Yes. Co-sign all of that. Dr. Ackerman is definitely the RJ expert in the room. And yes. And I also just want to make sure that the people who are listening also hear that RJ is incredible and powerful, and it's not the correct answer for everyone. And so it would be a mistake for the Jewish community to be like, oh, well, then this is the one magical answer that's going to fix things, particularly in cases where there's been victimization. And particularly when we're talking, if there's a perpetrator victim and an institution involved, all the more so, this needs to be approached really, really carefully. Some people draw the distinction between the victim consents to doing RJ and the victim has asked for RJ. And somebody may say yes to something because it feels like they're supposed to say yes. And we want to make sure that in any victim-centered approach, which that's where the healing happens, we need to be really careful that we find the correct approach for that situation and the way that is going to most bring healing to the person or people who have been harmed.
Thank you. April.
As I've been doing, I'm going to respond to this in a particular specific way, where there's a part of the way you phrased the question, Guila, that prompted me to say, in addition to what has already been brilliantly articulated, what I want to add to the discussion is this, because you mentioned at some point that at times folks wanting to avoid this work or to avoid facing this. In my line of work, I see again and again, whether it's around societies or specific individuals, that once harm has been committed or has been done, it does not just disappear. It doesn't go away. I often joke with my friends and family. How do I say this? I don't know if it's appropriate to say in a professional setting like this, but that crying or emotional relief should be like other bodily functions. They should be regular, because that also, like our emotions, just like other things in our bodies, don't just disappear. It's either going to go somewhere else and become cancerous, or have us holding on to something that makes it hard to function. And so I want to speak to that specific point that you raised in your question around whether it's restorative justice or other modalities, that an element of white supremacy culture, there's a very famous article about this that you can look up by Kenneth Jones and Tema Okun, for those who are interested. One of the elements of white supremacy culture is a fear of open conflict. And yet, that open conflict, or that doesn't have to be conflict, but that open addressing of dissonance is where there is emergent opportunity for growth, for healing, for innovation that we need, whether it's around climate change, race, gender violence, that often these things that are hard to look at or feel unfaceable are the places that we need to go with the different tools that have been talked about, with mindfulness, with patience, with compassion, through relationship, with the support of community, to come back to these things and address them. Because as I said, whether it's around what we're facing today in terms of our conflicts, or these issues will surface again and it will get worse over time. It's like management. Like something is coming up, you need to mindfully nip it in the bud, because often it's going to show up later and it's going to be worse. And so it's just a matter of when we want to deal with it, because eventually we will, or someone will, in terms of self-harm or institutional harm. So I think that's what I have to say about that, Devarti.
Thank you. We're going to close the session now, but I just want everyone to know, I know there are more questions from participants. I've tried to embed them into the questions here. This by no means is meant to be a one-off conversation that SRE is exploring just for today. This is the start of hopefully continued conversation around accountability at the intersections, around different modalities of accountability. I thank the three of you so much from the bottom of my heart. This has been such a great conversation. I have more questions for you from what we talked about before, but even from this discussion. So thank you for taking the time. Thank you all who are listening, and please continue to have the conversation with us. Thank you so much.